eliminated presidential term limits so that Chavez could remain in power indefinitely. When Chavez, now dying of cancer, was reelected in 2012, the contest was free but not fair. Chavismo controlled much of the media and deployed the vast machinery of the government in its favor. And after his death a year later, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, won another questionable re-election. And in 2014, his government imprisoned a major opposition leader. Still, the opposition's landslide victory in 2015 seemed to belie critics' claims that Venezuela was no longer democratic. It was only when a new single-party constituent assembly usurped the power of Congress in 2017, nearly 2 decades after Chavez first won the presidency, that Venezuela was widely recognized as an autocracy. This is how democracies now die. Blatant dictatorship in the form of fascism, communism, or military rule has disappeared across much of the world. Military coups and other violent seizures of power are now rare. Most countries hold regular elections. Democracies still die, but by other means. Since the end of the Cold War, most democratic breakdowns have been caused not by generals and soldiers, but by elected governments themselves, like Chavez in Venezuela. Elected leaders have subverted democratic institutions in Georgia, in Hungary, in Nicaragua, in Peru, in the Philippines, in Poland, in Russia, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and Ukraine. Democratic backsliding today begins at the ballot box. The electoral road to breakdown is dangerously deceptive. With a classic coup d'etat, as in Pinochet's Chile, the death of a democracy is immediate and evident to all. The presidential palace burns. The president is killed, imprisoned, or shipped into exile. The Constitution is suspended or scrapped. On the electoral road, however, none of those things happen. There are no tanks in the streets. Constitutions and other nominally democratic institutions remain in place. People still vote. Elected autocrats maintain a veneer of democracy while eviscerating its substance. Many government efforts to subvert democracy are, quote, legal, in the sense that they are approved by the legislature or accepted by the courts. They may even be portrayed as efforts to improve democracy, making the judiciary more efficient, combating corruption, cleaning up the electoral process. Newspapers still publish, but are bought off or bullied into self-censorship. Citizens continue to criticize the government, but often find themselves facing tax or other legal troubles. This sows public confusion. People do not immediately realize what is happening. Many continue to believe they are living in a democracy. In 2011, when a Latino Barometro survey asked Venezuelans to rate their own country from 1, not at all democratic, to 10, completely democratic, 51% of respondents gave their country a score of 8 or higher, meaning they weighed in, saying the country looks pretty democratic. Because there is no single moment, no coup, no declaration of martial law, no suspension of the Constitution, in which the regime obviously crosses the line into dictatorship. Nothing sets off society's alarm bells. And those who denounce government abuse may be dismissed as exaggerating or crying wolf. Democracy's erosion is, for many, almost imperceptible. The authors continue in this introduction. How vulnerable is American democracy to this form of backsliding? The foundation of our democracies are certainly stronger than those in Venezuela or Turkey or Hungary. But are they strong enough? Answering such a question requires stepping back from daily headlines and breaking news alerts to widen our view, drawing lessons from the experiences of other democracies around the world, and throughout history. Studying other democracies in crisis allows us to better understand the challenges facing our own democracy. For example, based on the historical experience of other nations, we, the authors, have developed a litmus test to help identify would-be autocrats before they come to power. We can learn from mistakes that past democratic leaders have made in opening the door to would-be authoritarians, and conversely, from the ways that have kept extremists out of power. A comparative approach also reveals how elected autocrats in different parts of the world employ remarkably similar strategies to subvert the democratic institutions. As these patterns become visible, steps toward breakdown grow less ambiguous and easier to combat. Knowing how citizens in other democracies have successfully resisted elected autocrats, or why they tragically failed to do so, is essential to those seeking to defend American democracy today. We know that extremist demagogues emerge from time to time in all societies, even in healthy democracies. The United States has had its share of them, including Henry Ford and Huey Long and Joe McCarthy and George Wallace. An essential test for democracies is not whether such figures emerge, but whether political leaders, and especially political parties, work to prevent them from gaining power in the first place by keeping them off mainstream party tickets, refusing to endorse or align with them, and when necessary, making common cause with rivals in support of our democratic candidates. Isolating popular extremists requires political courage. But when fear, opportunism, or miscalculation leads established parties to bring extremists into the mainstream, democracy is imperiled. Once a would-be authoritarian makes it to power, democracies face a second critical test. Will the autocratic leader subvert democratic institutions or be constrained by those institutions? Institutions alone are not enough to rein in elected autocrats. Constitutions must be defended by political parties and organized citizens, but also by democratic norms. Without robust norms, constitutional checks and balances do not serve as the bulwarks of democracy we imagine them to be. Institutions become political weapons, wielded forcefully by those who control them against those who do not. This is how elected autocrats subvert democracy, packing and weaponizing the courts and other neutral agencies, buying off the media and the private sector, or bullying them into silence, and rewriting the rules of politics to tilt the playing field against opponents. The tragic paradox of the elected route to authoritarianism is that democracy's assassins use the very institutions of democracy gradually, subtly, and even legally to kill it. America failed the first test in November 2016 when we elected a president with dubious allegiance to democratic norms. Again, I'm reading from the book by these two scholars. Donald Trump's surprise victory is made possible not only by public disaffection, but also by the Republican Party's failure to keep an extremist demagogue within its own ranks from gaining the nomination. How serious is the threat now? Written in 2018. Many observers take comfort in our Constitution, designed precisely to thwart and contain demagogues. Our Madisonian system of checks and balances has endured for more than 2 centuries. It survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Cold War. It survived Watergate. Surely then it will survive Trump. We are less certain. Historically, our system of checks and balance has worked pretty well, but not entirely because of the constitutional system designed by the founders. Democracies work best and survive longer when constitutions are reinforced by unwritten democratic norms. 2 basic norms have preserved America's checks and balances. in ways that we have often taken for granted. Mutual toleration, or the understanding that competing parties accept one another as legitimate. And forbearance, or the idea that politicians should exercise restraint in deploying their institutional prerogatives. These two norms undergirded American democracy for most of the 20th century. Leaders of the two major parties accepted one another as legitimate and resisted the temptation to use their temporary control of institutions to maximize partisan advantage. Norms of toleration and restraint served as the soft guardrails of American democracy, helping it avoid the kind of partisan fight to the death that has destroyed democracies elsewhere in the world, including Europe in the 30s and South America in the 1960s and the 1970s. Today, however, the guardrails of American democracy are weakening. The erosion of our democratic norms began in the 1980s and 1990s and accelerated in the 2000s. By the time Barack Obama became president, many Republicans questioned the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals and had abandoned forbearance for a strategy of winning by any means necessary. Donald Trump may have accelerated this process, but he didn't cause it. The challenges facing American democracy run deeper. The weakening of our democratic norms is rooted in extreme partisan polarization, one that extends beyond policy differences into existential conflict over race and culture. American efforts to achieve racial equality as our society grows increasingly diverse have fueled an insidious reaction and intensifying polarization. And if one thing is clear from studying breakdowns throughout history, it's the extreme polarization that can kill democracies. There are, therefore, reasons for alarm, say the authors. Not only did Americans elect a demagogue in 2016, but we did so at a time when the norms that once protected our democracy were already coming unmoored. But if other countries' experiences teach us that polarization can kill democracies, they also teach us that breakdown is not inevitable. It is not irreversible. Drawing lessons from other democracies, our book suggests strategies that citizens should and should not follow to defend our democracy. Many Americans are justifiably frightened by what is happening to our country. But protecting our democracy requires more than fright, more than outrage. It must be humble and bold. We must learn from other countries to see the warning signs and recognize the false alarms. We must be aware of the fateful missteps that have wrecked other democracies. And we must see how citizens have risen to meet the great democratic crises of the past, overcoming their own deep-seated divisions to avert breakdown. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. The promise of history and the hope, the authors say of their book, is that we find the rhymes before it is too late. There are two key points in that introduction that we have been accustomed to thinking of democracies failing through a military coup. So as long as there is not a military coup, as long as the presidential palace is not burned, as long as troops don't march in the street and the Constitution is not thrown out and replaced by martial law, we're fine. But the second key point is that that is not the way democracies die today, is not by martial law, not by military coups, not, as the authors put it, by men with guns. Democracies die today by elected leaders, augmenting their power in an authoritarian quest, developing additional momentum from a rubber-stamped Congress, gaining further power from decisions handed down by a court, and then using the institutions of the government. Since returning to office in January, President Trump has willfully and continually broken the law. The path for this lawbreaking was clear before Trump returned to office. On July 1st, 2024, the Supreme Court's conservative majority found invisible ink in our Constitution. It says presidents have absolute immunity for committing crimes if they are done as official acts. The Brennan Center for Justice said of this ruling, quote, "Unfounded in both history and legal precedent, the decision poses a risk to our system of governance." I'm going to share with you their analysis of that ruling. This is the ruling, Trump versus the United States, that I commented on earlier, in which I said the Supreme Court has decided that the president is a king, immune from prosecution for committing crimes as long as they do it as an act of government. And once again, I'll emphasize that when this was going to the court, I said there is no way that our Supreme Court says the president is above the law. No way that he's immune for prosecution for crimes committed, because our founders were terrified of the president being immune from the law. They were terrified of a president being a king. And they like to say they're originalists. And if you look at the original context, it's so emphasized in every possible way that the checks and balances were designed to make sure that the president was not a king, that the vision for the country was hammered out in legislation crafted by people elected to serve in the House and serve in the Senate. And the president was to execute those laws, was to implement those laws, not to act as the sole power, crafting the vision, deciding what programs to fund, deciding how much money to give them, and over here, Congress is just a rubber stamp.